don't get tripped up on the color differences. There isn't like a terrorist color and a non-terrorist color. Never did I see like people afraid of being identified at a protest to the point where they felt like they needed to cover their face for fear of either not being able to get a job after they graduated, losing their like opportunity to be a tenured professor. There are professors across the United States who have lost their tenureship opportunity or have been blacklisted from obtaining tenureship simply because they have a position on the Palestine-Israel conflict. The big lie or myth out there that I want to draw people's attention to is the lie or myth that because someone is pro-Palestine, they're pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, pro-violence against innocent civilians. Nothing, I'm going to say this clearly, nothing could be further from the truth, folks. Hi there, folks. I'm the host of HaRLeM Lights, Omar Mansi, and this is, I think, unexpectedly what is going to be my very first monologue for the HaRLeM Lights podcast and HaRLeM Lights channel. I'm going to ask everyone, please subscribe, like, and share as broadly as possible this video along with any other future videos that we put out. It really will help get our podcast and channel established right out the gate and ensure that we're able to continue bringing this type of content in the future. So again, please, if you like what you're about to see as far as content and these types of framings and explanations of various issues, please subscribe to the channel, to the podcast, like us, and share us as broadly as possible. With that being said, for my very first monologue, what I wanted to do, and this was brought about because we keep on hearing about these different protesters and people who are here either as visa holders, student visa holders, or green card holders in the case of one very famous incident. And even American citizens are quite honestly starting to become concerned that some of their civil liberties and First Amendment rights may potentially be under attack or violated with their demonstrating support and solidarity for the Palestinian Palestine movement or Palestinian cause. And what I want to do is just deconstruct one issue around the latest news around protests and protesters that I think is something that keeps on getting lost and possibly misunderstood by a lot of folks out there, especially Americans, fellow Americans who have no connection really to the Middle East, no connection. They have no Arab friends, no Muslim friends, and really are just hearing things in the news, in the media ecosystem, whether it's on social media or traditional mainstream media. And I think that there's something that really needs to be cleared up here, and that's why I wanted to make this video. So to start off, what I'm talking about here is the Keffiyeh, right? So those of you who are maybe not familiar, this Keffiyeh here, right, is something that, and this is just a version of it, right? Something that looks very similar to what you may see on the news or in social media around Palestine solidarity, Palestine protests, pro-Palestinian protesting, etc. And you'll often find this Keffiyeh, right? You keep hearing about it, this term. And what it refers to kind of colloquially now is this headpiece that sometimes is worn as a scarf. You see people putting it around their neck, and some people wear it over their head, and other people wear it and actually will obscure their face. And what I want to do is just explain something around this, and that I think is very important, and contextualize it in terms of our country as Americans, and for us as Americans to really be able to wrap our heads around and fully digest what it means culturally in terms of for Palestinians or for Middle Eastern people. So the Keffiyeh, the simplest way to put it is, the Keffiyeh is a head garment, right? So much like I'm wearing a baseball cap, or someone could wear a cowboy hat in certain parts of the United States, the Keffiyeh is really no different in terms of being a head garment, right? A head garment that people historically in the Middle East use to protect themselves from the sun. So obviously the Middle East is known for being a very arid, dry, deserty type of climate. There are exceptions, of course. In the Middle East, there are some pockets that are very green and lush and really resemble the California Valley. But for the most part, the Middle East is much drier and hotter, and the sun is much more of a concern or danger to people when they're outside for extended periods of time than in the majority of Western countries, European countries, or climates, or the United States, other than maybe the Southwest of the United States. And so people will wear this over their head in order to protect themselves from the sun. The back of their necks, their faces. They can even use it to wrap it around their face if there's a lot of glare coming off of something, or off of water, or off of the sand, in a very extreme desert environment, like somewhere in the Gulf, Gulf countries. But for the most part, that really is its purpose. You see it in biblical movies, reenactments of the life of Jesus, of the life of Moses. You see them having this kind of the shepherd with the staff walking around in the hills of ancient Middle East, and having this head garment on their head protecting themselves. Now, I do want to explain something in relation to the generational difference between what the keffiyeh, or these types of head garments, meant to like an older generation versus the modern generation, and then also kind of tie it into the Palestine solidarity movement. So in terms of your average Middle Eastern or Arab person, Arab American like myself, Palestinian American like myself, or from any other country with a background from any other country, family roots that tie to the Middle East, this was typically a headgear that was worn for men by our grandparents, or perhaps our parents, depending on how old we are. So it's kind of an older generation type of garment. Like when I go visit the Middle East, you'll rarely, I should say, see like young people, right? Like 20-year-olds, teenagers, or even up until like maybe older millennials like myself, or like a Gen Xer, wearing this type of headgear, right? They typically will wear a baseball cap, or they've got their hair gelled and all done up in a sharp kind of modern way, and they wear a t-shirt and jeans, or whatever it might be, but not really this, right? Not really this type of headgear. And so it really is something that was ubiquitously worn by older generations, okay? Much in the same way, if I can draw a parallel to the cowboy hat for most, I would say, of parts of the United States, right? There are still parts of the United States. I got this in Texas when I was down in Houston, just because as a child of the 80s, having grown up with a lot of like cowboy movies and Westerns and Indiana Jones type of characters that were adventurers and stuff like that growing up as a kid in America, cowboy hats were always cool. It was like, man, I really wish I could wear a cowboy hat. That would be so awesome. They just look so, regal and just, macho man and whatever else. And so, but when, in Texas, there are parts of Texas where a lot of people wear the cowboy hat, even younger people. But for the majority, I would say, of the United States, right, people don't no longer wear the cowboy hat as like a standard, excuse me, as a standard piece of attire when they're just going about their day, or socializing, or going to work, or whatever. Now, maybe a better example would be like a top hat, like the way we see those, the popularity of those movies like Peaky Blinders and some of the, what's the one I'm thinking about? The Sherlock Holmes, that kind of era, the early 1900s, up until maybe about World War II, where men wore top hats and different types of like, fur-coated hats, where that kind of just, it faded out, right? And now you really don't see anyone wearing those unless they're balding and they're kind of trying to reconcile and come to terms with the fact that they're balding, and therefore they might wear some kind of a hipster, cool, old-timey sort of hat, or someone just thinks that it looks awesome and they're trying to rock it for fun or whatever. But I would say a good analogy is a cowboy hat, right? So, you see parts of maybe Montana, ranch country, Wyoming, where people will still wear this. I grew up in Iowa. In rural Iowa, sometimes you would see people turn up with a cowboy hat if they were really like a big FFA, like Future Farmers of America type of family, farm family. They get into the rodeo, the local rodeo that comes through and gets organized each summer. Those types of people that are really into, raising animals and farming and stuff like that would wear, still to this day, young people or older people would maybe wear the cowboy hat. But in general, you wouldn't see people at Iowa State University, even the kids who came from farm backgrounds, they might rock their cowboy boots and jeans and a big belt buckle, at least when I was in college, but they wouldn't wear a cowboy hat unless there was like an event and they were trying to kind of fashion show off or show up rocking a cowboy hat as a kind of a statement or a throwback to something to show people that that's what their cultural connection is to. So I would say nowadays, you might see in the Middle East a grandfather, someone in their 60s, 70s, 80s, wearing a head garment like this. And they could be wearing traditional, like what we would call a thobe or a dishdasha, which is kind of like a long robe, right? Like you see Middle Easterners where they wear like a long, even men will wear like a long robe type of garment, and be wearing something like this with like a black band on top to keep it fixed to their head. The other person you might see wearing this is even some, more metropolitan, older generation men would wear a suit. Like my grandfather would wear a suit, and he would still wear like a plain white keffiyeh over his head, just because of, I think, the traditional comfort of just having your head protected, wearing it essentially like a baseball cap for that generation of Middle Eastern men. Now, in terms of younger people wearing it, I would say that, younger people will wear these at weddings if they're, going to a wedding party and they're dancing, or if they're going to like a special function and they want to kind of use it as like a throwback statement or a fashion piece to kind of show that they're doing something folk style or country style, much like, when I went to Texas, for example, I went and toured the Johnson Space Center. And when I was there were a lot of Australian tourists that happened to be coming through on the tour with us. And one of the Australian tourists, he had like the most American outfit, right? Like the best blue jeans, cowboy boots, belt buckle, the checkered kind of shirt, button-up shirt, and then a giant, really beautiful cowboy hat. And I thought he was maybe from rural Midwest or from Texas, a native. And I started talking to them, and it turns out he's from Australia, and he bought all this stuff as a tourist would, just to kind of fit in and memorabilia, essentially, right, of visiting Texas and experiencing Texan culture. So he wore all that stuff. You still have young people that will show up to different weddings and functions and parties and things like that in the Middle East, and they might rock something like this with their jeans and t-shirt as they're dancing, as they're kind of horsing around and having a good time with their friends and family. So my point is that it really is just another garment, a piece of attire, like a hat, like a baseball cap, like a cowboy hat, or like maybe another good example would be a do-rag, right? For the African-American community, Black people, you folks know that the do-rag is something that I've seen in movies. I've seen people wear it going around. You've seen people who are kind of, even in movies, sometimes they'll portray it as a cultural thing. I'm trying to remember the movie that I'm thinking of. It's escaping me right now, but there's movies where, the person's like a high-functioning, professional, super educated Black man who's kind of, owning his identity and his confidence in what he's become and what he's built as a life for himself. And then it'll show like when he gets out of his work attire and he's being casual, that he threw on a do-rag and was like working out or going jogging or whatever, just to show people. I interpret that or think that the point of that was to show people that, hey, look, a do-rag is not some symbol of like thug gangster culture. It's more a reclaiming of it as being Black culture. And the actor in this case in the movie, again, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, would, get into their suit, their high power attorney suit or their high power businessman suit during the day. And then when they were casual on the weekend or working out, they threw on a do-rag, and it was completely kind of normal, right? It's just another piece of headgear that has a certain cultural connotation to it. Now, that's the kind of high level explanation of the keffiyeh. Now, in order to kind of clarify another point, I want to share with you something here, and I just want to make sure that I capture everything that I originally intended to share. So there's an example that I want to bring up too of when I was in college, our family got to know someone who was pretty high placed in terms of the South Sudanese community that was at Iowa State University. And this is a community that historically had a lot of, had trouble, issues, grievances with at the time, the North Sudanese or the main Sudanese government or regime under, I believe it was Omar al-Bashir. And this South Sudanese gentleman ended up becoming a very high-level person in the United Nations. They ended up later on having connections with people from the South Sudanese government. And just by chance, we happened to cross paths for some reason with these folks. They were, very nice people in terms of in the community. And we happened to get to know this guy who later on went to become like a very high-level prominent figure, if not the leader of South Sudan, I believe. And this gentleman had some really strong tie-ins or relationships with the Bush administration at the time, with George W. Bush. And George W. Bush, I believe the story goes, gifted him a black cowboy hat. And that black cowboy hat was something that he ended up wearing and would continue to wear for many, many years after as like a publicity PR type of thing in order to draw attention to the fact that, he was trying to say, we have a strong connection with the Bush administration, and therefore America is behind the South Sudanese leadership or the South Sudanese cause, and to try to make some kind of a political connection and kind of propaganda, for lack of a better term, effort around promoting, himself as well as his kind of his overall, cause. So my point is that two other people who are not familiar with the background story, if they see this guy, a South Sudanese gentleman, very tall, very obviously not your typical presenting like white American African leader wearing this giant black cowboy hat, it's a mismatch, right? So in an African context, the black cowboy hat just didn't really come off as natural. It's obvious that this is like kind of implanted from some other culture, some other country or place. And so similarly, I think seeing a certain head garment out of context, right, or out of the place that you're normally used to seeing it can be a bit surprising to folks, or a bit maybe even intimidating if you don't understand why it's being done or what the background story is behind it. So with that, what I'd like to kind of jump into next is why or the role that the Keffiyeh has started to take in terms of our modern times politically, right? In terms of political, the Palestine solidarity movement, that kind of thing. And so what I want to explain is the colors, the differences in colors. Then we'll get to like why you see it more commonly in the United States, in the streets of Chicago and LA and Washington, D.C., New York, and even other places across the Midwest and in the South. So what I have here are a bunch of different colors, right? And I want to explain this in as best way I can. So I'm trying to draw this analogy that I think people can wrap their heads around, which is to Air Jordans and the different colorways that exist for Air Jordans. So for those of you who may be familiar with, we're in Chicago. HaRLeM Lights is based out of the southwest suburbs of Chicago, Little Palestine. And we are huge Michael Jordan fans, right? Obviously, we are my generation. I grew up like in the 90s, was old enough to watch the games. And I remember watching Michael Jordan's very last famous shot taken as a professional NBA player for the Bulls. Other folks, remember that era quite well. And Jordan has only increased in terms of fame and people wanting to, wear his shoes and stuff as a brand, even more so like in the late 2010s, 2010s. And you have these colorways, right, which are the same Jordan, the same shoe, but in different colors, right, different patterns of color. So this is like a classic like Chicago colorway of white and red. And then you have the super famous bread colorway of black and red, hence bread, the name bread colorway. Now, these are not like the $2,000 or $3,000 Jordans. These are like fake replicas. So please, nobody get any ideas on trying to break into the studio and steal these super expensive Jordans. I'm just kidding. But those are, basic idea of colorways, right? You can get blue and white, you can get green and white, you can get gold Jordans, you can get every color under the sun. In a similar way, there are different colorways for Keffiyehs. So you have a traditional kind of black and white Keffiyeh that's very much associated with Palestine. And then you also have these different colors that I grabbed some of these off of Amazon just to show as examples. You have this one that is more of a color that I think we would associate as Middle Easterners with our Yemeni or southern Gulf state, friends and brothers. And this one, again, also kind of darker yellow, like a rusty color, more of like maybe you'd see on like a Yemeni walking around in the southwest suburbs. This black and white, has become popular as well in recent years for whatever reason. This is a different style of keffiyeh that you might find someone wearing in Palestine or in other parts of the Middle East. This one is kind of like a special forces-y, kind of, it's got like a camo pattern, kind of take on the traditional black and white one. Again, I pulled some of these off of Amazon. Some of these are more traditional, actual Middle Eastern ones. Now, the popularity of these really started to explode, I think, after the Iraq War under the Bush administration, as well as the Afghan War, with the popularity of some of these military movies, right? So movies like Zero Dark 30, movies like American Sniper, movies where they show like veterans deployed in these countries that then start taking on special forces guys that are taking on the actual attire of the locals in order to either gain their trust, blend in, or show that they're a little bit more, they're cut out of a different cloth or mold compared to your average infantryman. They're special forces, they're Delta Force, they're Navy SEALs. And to give that like special operator look that Hollywood wants to kind of glamorize and make people, have a certain mystique about that type of job or that type of soldier. And so you started to see an explosion. I noticed it. Other people who are Middle Eastern in America with a Middle Eastern background started to notice it. After the wars kicked off, you started to see a lot of veterans coming back with some of these things, movies showing these, and you started to see people use them as like neck, scarves for jogging out, whether it's cold or hot, to protect your neck. As a fishing, I've seen people in Iowa use this as a fishing piece of attire to protect their necks and their faces from glare from the water while they're fishing all day out on a lake. I've seen people use this, people running like in the Mojave Desert, running in the Death Valley, these like 100K runs. You see UFC fighters and other famous types of athletes wearing these types of things as a functional piece of headgear, but that also ties into kind of that special operator, special forces community, maybe the online Jocko Willink type of vibe or community that wants to kind of portray themselves in terms of that tough guy, military type of person or athlete, as well as maybe even just to show solidarity or support for veterans. I've seen that take off in America. And so you've got, these analogies I'm trying to paint are just to give you an understanding that there is really, and this jumps to the next point, there is really a concerted effort, in my opinion, by people with certain interests to try to play off of people's biases or stereotypes and try to paint these as being something that you should fear, that the keffiyeh is a threat somehow to people in the United States, that it represents solidarity with terrorism or terrorist sympathizing, or that it represents some kind of terrorist garment, that people are emulating terrorists that they've seen in movies or on TV or social media, making videos or hostage videos from movies. I think of like 80s action flicks and 70s action, late 70s, early 80s, and then into the 80s and 90s, like Schwarzenegger movies, Stallone, maybe Charlie Sheen or Chuck Norris, Navy SEAL type. We're going to Beirut, and then everyone's wearing these and, shooting, of course, and trying to kill and rampage and all the rest. So all these negative associations, Hollywood propaganda, stereotyping of Middle Easterners and Middle Eastern culture, kind of a degree of Orientalism baked into it that I think is there's a concerted effort on the part of certain special interests around the issue of Israel-Palestine to really try to demonize and get people and to otherize the people who might wear something like this and make Americans feel like they should be afraid of this or that it's a threat in some way. It's a symbol of something negative, which could not be further from the truth. And so what I want to talk about are, maybe I'll touch on one more thing, which are the different colors. So certain countries or regions or ethnic groups in the Middle East lean towards certain colors, right? So the Palestinian color of black and white has traditionally been associated with the Palestinians and therefore the Palestinian cause. A lot of Palestinians, my grandfather wore just plain white, like a plain white cloth over his head. You'll see that as well. In Jordan, for example, strong ally of the United States, you'll see red and white being worn by a lot of that generation. Different parts of the Middle East have some of these like more yellow or rusty colored colors. It's a whole entire gradient or spectrum of different styles depending on ethnic groups, national identity or origin, and regional differences. So don't get tripped up on the color differences. There isn't like a terrorist color and a non-terrorist color. There really is just colors based on where people live, and historically, for whatever reason, a certain color stuck, and everyone in that region or of that national, or maybe as countries came out of the colonial period and they started to establish themselves as states, not as just territories or previous colonies of the great powers, they maybe they symbolized or nationalized a certain color, and that became the official color of like that country. That's probably part of what happened with a lot of these countries as well. So please keep that in mind as we move on here. I want to hit on a few other points related to the Keffiyeh. So we talked about the colorway explanation or example. We talked about cowboy hats. How it became a symbol of the Palestinian cause is kind of something that maybe we can touch on quickly. So as the Palestine conflict went on it's been going on for 75 years at this point plus, this became a symbol of the Palestinian people. And then in the West, in the United States, in capitals across Europe, protesting and wearing this became kind of a solidarity symbol. So people will wear this around their necks at a protest, or they'll wear it as a scarf. If like I've seen at Iowa State University growing up, like you'd see a professor who's not even Palestinian, who's a Jewish professor. I've seen tons of those Jewish professors who are against the negative things that the state of Israel is doing, and are not against Israel. They're for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, one in which both sides get there's either a two-state or a one-state solution. I don't want to get into all those details. That's a whole nother topic for a different discussion or podcast. But the point is that I've seen average American white professors who have nothing to do culturally with Judaism or Islam or Palestinian or Israel. I've seen people who are actually Jewish people who are in solidarity with Palestine. And I've seen, of course, other Middle Easterners, like you see professors who are from Lebanon, who are from Syria, who are not from any of the countries involved in the actual conflict. They will actually wear this just to show solidarity and to raise awareness. Now, an example of what that might look like in an American context would be like celebrities or people going around and wearing a pin in solidarity with people who have gone and survived breast cancer. You'll see like the pink colored pin, or people who might wear like a small. During the Ukraine escalation, you see people wear like a Ukrainian flag or some other symbols of Ukraine. I stand with Ukraine, or whatever it might be. People, for multiple different reasons, whether they're social causes, environmental causes, you name it, would do this in terms of trying to bring attention to an issue or an item in the news and raise awareness. And I think people do that a lot with the Keffiyeh. And then it slowly over time morphed into becoming synonymous or one and the same with supporting the Palestinian cause. So people throw the Keffiyeh on, they go to a protest, they're trying to show their solidarity. They wear this while they're in an interview or they're on TV or whatever it might be. They're showing their solidarity. So the issue here of the Keffiyeh being worn as a symbol of the Palestinian cause is really nothing new. I mean, this goes back, I remember in the, high school years, back in the early 2000s, I would say well before my time, even back into the, 80s and 90s. Anytime there was some kind of a global awareness around the Palestine issue, people have worn the Keffiyeh as a way of showing solidarity or support for that particular cause. Now, what I want to talk about as far as the latest stuff that we've been hearing in the news around protests, protesters that have been deported or kind of, for lack of a better term, disappeared with lack of due process, simply because they don't have the protection of being American citizens, because they participated in some kind of a pro-Palestine protest or rally. What I want to draw attention to is this issue of people, covering their faces. And so I think a lot of folks out there might be like, up until this point, hey, listen, Omar, I completely hear you. I get it. Sounds like maybe I had a misunderstanding. This is just some cultural stuff. There really isn't, a boogeyman or a need to be afraid in terms of this Keffiyeh headscarf thing or headdress. However, why do people cover their faces up? Covering your face seems to be intimidating. It seems to me that someone is able to then obfuscate identification and accountability or apprehension by law enforcement if they were to break a law. They could get away with some kind of a crime, or they're ready to commit a crime because their face is covered. And so what I want to make a few points around this is the Palestine issue and being pro-Palestinian in terms of taking a position in favor of Palestinian self-determination and liberation, and the ability for Palestinian people to live in peace side by side with their Israeli counterparts. Really, there's no other political or social issue that I can think of that has become as polarizing or weaponized in terms of, I think back to when the Ukraine crisis or the Russian invasion of Ukraine first kicked off, right? There were so many people that I remember as Americans who were pro-Ukrainian, right? Saying, I saw semi-trucks all around Chicago and other cities in the United States when I would travel that had these big stickers or bumper stickers saying that I stand with Ukraine, I support Ukraine. I remember on social media, people had these icons or badges or rings around their avatar, their profile name or picture, showing solidarity with Ukraine. I even remember LinkedIn, which is supposed to be one of the most kind of apolitical, professional social media platforms that really people don't try to bring their politics into LinkedIn because it's viewed as kind of being one and the same of being at work, right? You wouldn't bring your politics to work, to the workplace. People disagree on politics. It's divisive. Therefore, the workplace shouldn't be a place for politics or opinions around, the stuff that we typically don't bring our opinions up around polite company, right? Religion, politics, stances on social issues that are controversial, et cetera. And so it was really surprising to me and to others to see that when the Ukraine issue kicked off, I mean, there were so many people that were coming out on LinkedIn showing their solidarity with Ukraine. But if anyone had even thought for a second of doing the same thing when it came to the Palestine-Israel issue, people would never do it. I mean, I'm talking about people who are either Middle Eastern backgrounded or maybe even not. Like people, like I said, there are tons of people around this issue who are Jewish that are against the policies of the state of Israel and think that there are a lot of things that need to change and be prevented from occurring or continuing to occur vis-a-vis the Palestinian population that is under their control in a lot of ways. And so people were shocked. We were shocked to see that, if you came out as, like, let's say you're a manager, you're an executive, you're a director level person, and you all of a sudden started posting on LinkedIn about being pro-Palestinian or pro-Palestine, I mean, you would probably get called into an HR conversation saying, hey, listen, we really need you to cut that out. You're associating the company's name on LinkedIn now with a Palestinian position or cause that you feel strongly about. However, we don't want to be mixing these two. It's divisive, it's controversial, et cetera. When it came to Ukraine, however, we didn't see that. There was a clear double standard. And I think that's what I want your average person who doesn't know enough about the conflict or isn't close to it personally to understand something, which is that a lot of the outrage and frustration and anger that you see out there is not so much about one little particular thing. It's one little thing ignites the overall issue of there being a double standard and a really, lack of a better term, a hypocrisy around some of these items in terms of how they're framed and how they're either accepted and celebrated by the media or society in general versus how they may be demonized and kind of ostracized and blacklisted. And so tying back to this Keffiyeh issue and people covering their faces, you never saw any impetus for people involved in a Ukraine protest, pro-Ukrainian or against American backing of Ukraine. It was polarized, right? So some people wanted America to full-fledged, like go in there with tons of money, weapons, even put boots on the ground in terms of special forces support, et cetera, to support the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion. And there was another, like half the country who were against any American involvement, a more isolationist camp that really did not want to see the United States of America, after having gone through these big wars that we just went through all throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Iraq and Afghanistan, and other drone warfare across the Middle East and North Africa, they were like, we need to stop this. We are not the world's police. We have so much that's already wrecked and dysfunctional in the United States. We have infrastructure issues, roads, schools, all the rest. Why are we involving ourselves in this giant, cost in terms of treasure, but taxpayer dollars, as well as potentially more American lives? Absolutely not. It's not for us. So it was very polarized. There were, I'm sure, across the United States at embassies or other places, universities, protests for Ukraine, support of Ukraine, and protests against supporting the war in Ukraine. And not in any of those cases did I ever hear of, and maybe I'm just not in the right circles on social media or whatever, but I never came across articles. I'm a fairly decently plugged in person to what's going on in the world. Never did I see like people afraid of being identified at a protest to the point where they felt like they needed to cover their face for fear of either not being able to get a job after they graduated, losing their opportunity to be a tenured professor. There are professors across the United States who have lost their tenureship opportunity or have been blacklisted from obtaining tenureship simply because they have a position on the Palestine-Israel conflict. And even saying Palestine-Israel conflict is just, it's itself, saying that is potentially controversial. So please, for those of you who are listening, forgive me. I'm really, this is, like I said, my first monologue surrounding this podcast or associated with this podcast that I'm trying to do. And I really am doing my best to try to just raise awareness and bring the issue up in a way that your average person who's not as close to this issue can relate to. So please give me some empathy and some understanding and grace in terms of some of the technical terminology. Depending on your audience, I think it's important to frame things in a way that they can relate to. So going back to the point, so not to beat a dead horse, but I'm almost done with this, but the keffiyeh being wrapped around someone's face to obscure their identity is not so that they can vandalize property and so that they can go burn down a building or that they can go, assault a police officer who's trying to do crowd control. That is the vast, vast minority of situations that have ever occurred around these protests, right? I've been to several of them. I've seen other people. I know people who've been to them, people who are, salt of the earth Americans, people who are from the Jewish community, Jewish solidarity with Palestine, Jews for peace, etc. And these people are some of the greatest folks you're ever going to meet, you're ever going to come across. Super compassionate, loving, loyal Americans who just have a position, First Amendment protected position around the Israel-Palestine issue. And some of them have covered their faces because they're afraid that certain interests who have influence and power in business, in media, in education will do something to try to destroy their reputation and destroy their opportunities for employment just because they identified themselves at a protest or were partaking in First Amendment protected speech. And that's a very dangerous road for us to go down as Americans. I think there are a lot of people now on social media who are drawing attention to this. I mean, I'm one of those people who started listening to some of these podcast kings, as they call them, the Joe Rogans, the Sam Harrises, the Jordan Peterson. I slowly watched actually as each one of these people rose to fame and notoriety. And it was amazing to see. I mean, there was a period in the early 2000s, like I would say 2017, 2016, when I first heard of, Joe Rogan, he's got a podcast, this guy who does jujitsu. I actually heard about him from the jujitsu community. I started doing jujitsu because I had seen people on the UFC eating Buffalo Wild Wings occasionally growing up in the United States. And I was, that'd be really cool. I'm at a point in my life where I was like 30, 31. I'm like, I want to get healthier. I want to get in more, fit shape, whatever. Work was kind of just becoming crazy. And with work, you eat and you work and you eat and you gain weight. I was like, I want to change my lifestyle. So I signed up for jujitsu. Went to my first class, fell in love with it, kept doing it. And then people would be like, you hear something on JRE yesterday? Hey, last night on JRE. And I'm like, what's JRE? Oh, the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm like, oh, Joe Rogan, you mean that guy from, what's it called? Fear Factor from back in the 90s and when I was growing up? Oh yeah, he's got a podcast. He's a, UFC commentator. But I'm like, oh yeah, okay. I remember. Yeah, he is associated with UFC. Oh, he's got a podcast. Oh. So I started checking it out. And it was absolutely mind-boggling to see the quality of conversations and the diversity of conversations that were being had in this relatively obscure, compared to mainstream voices at the time, guy named Joe Rogan on a podcast that would go 2 or 3 hours long. And so I remember then slowly, like you heard, there was no such thing as Jordan Peterson. There was no such thing as, let alone later on when you start to get these bigger personalities. I mean, Ben Shapiro was probably around at that time, starting to get popularity. You would hear about him here and there, but these folks were not quite as established as they are right now. But my point in bringing them up is that they would be the absolute loudest voices around promoting free speech, right? And in a lot of ways, I have a lot of respect in terms of what Joe Rogan has done. And there are so many positive things about, in my opinion, the Joe Rogan experience, the show, the guests, the exposure to certain issues. And there are some things that I disagree with, but that doesn't mean you necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. In my opinion, I like to take what's positive from everyone and leave the negative or the points of disagreement can be debated if you have the opportunity to debate them with someone and have an intelligent conversation. And so I would see these people who are like the absolute most stalwart type of, staunch pro First Amendment free speech people that, you'd come across, right, on social media and alternative media at the time. And they were upset about all kinds of things that, why are conservative voices being silenced slowly on Twitter was the big gripe at the time. Why are conservative voices being kicked off or deplatformed or demonetized? Or, they would say that someone was caught dead naming someone who was in the trans community and therefore they lost their platform or got kicked off of Twitter. Things like that were constant grievances by people who were kind of middle, maybe traditionally middle left, but then slowly migrated over to like middle right or conservative just because of them being disillusioned for whatever reason with what they felt like was a fringe left that kind of went off the rails. I'm just kind of explaining what I feel like their interpretation has been. And so what I'd like to say is, if they are so staunchly First Amendment, I mean, Jordan Peterson would come on. When I remember his first showing on Joe Rogan, people were blown away. Oh my God, Jordan Peterson, this guy talks about religion and theology in such a deep way. He talks about these examples from, the Bible and from, the Abrahamic faith traditions in such a positive and uplifting and motivational way. This is a voice that we've never heard. And he slowly rose to superstardom online because of his obviously his intellectual wit and sophistication, his ability to be a very, very eloquent and great orator, and for his ability to frame things in ways that people can relate to. And I think one of the big things that they all shared in common, including like Sam Harris, big like atheist voice that has a lot of positive things intellectually to offer on different topics. However, in my opinion, very misplaced and very dangerous when it comes to the Palestine issue. But regardless, that's neither here nor there for this particular monologue. My point is that these people all were against any kind of tamping down or preventing people from free speech and protected First Amendment speech. They were like, the most staunch free speech folks that were out there. And then suddenly, what I found very shocking, even during COVID, these were people who were like the contrarian kind of dissidents against the government COVID policies. They became super famous because of their stances against certain COVID policies. And free speech was one of the biggest things that they were advocates for, saying that free speech was being prevented by mainstream media, the government, the liberals, the Democrats, because people had certain positions around COVID. And now, if you had suspicion about vaccine efficacy, now you were all of a sudden blacklisted, you were demonetized, or you lost your job if you were a doctor. They were saying things like, anyone who was critical of certain policies of the Biden administration around COVID, those people lost their jobs. There was just this sense that if you had an opinion, your First Amendment wasn't protecting you because the government was able to then shut you down regardless, and you had nowhere to go, and you were out of your livelihood if you were making your livelihood online, or if you were out of a position or blacklisted from some of the more establishment kind of company Fortune 500 jobs. I find it very ironic, and honestly, double standard is probably, putting it lightly, hypocritical is probably a better word, that on the issue of Palestine and free speech and being pro-Palestine, suddenly it's acceptable in America for people to fear having their jobs protected, being blacklisted as they leave university from being able to get jobs, at really good jobs. I'm talking people who are graduating Ivy League, very sophisticated, smart, intelligent, talented young men and women, being able to go get jobs, being blacklisted from certain law firms, people being, really just like honestly like harassed and chased after academically or professionally based on something in their personal life that is a protected First Amendment right, which is being able to speak about an issue. And the big lie or myth out there that I want to draw people's attention to is the lie or myth that because someone is pro-Palestine, they're pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, pro-violence against innocent civilians. Nothing, I'm going to say this clearly, nothing could be further from the truth, folks. There is no way you're going to convince me, just like you can't convince nowadays the right or a Piers Morgan type of personality that, you know, Elon Musk's Sig Heil seeming salute was anything other than a "my heart goes out to you." You're not going to convince people that that was a Sig Heil. I'm sorry. Like, there are people that will just not see it that way. And I'm not taking a position one way or the other on that. That has its own discussion that the whole time that needs to be unpacked very carefully. But what I am saying is, just like there are people who just would absolutely not accept that, I need people to understand that it is that ridiculous to the majority of people who are involved in the Palestine solidarity movement that being pro-Palestine means that you're pro-terrorism or you're that it's definitionally tied to Hamas. Nothing could be further from the truth. You would have to, you know, have the same radical claim, and people will say, well, are you crazy? You know, Elon Musk, you're saying that he did a Sig Heil thing. Are you saying he's a Nazi? You know, this is a guy who has Jewish friends. He employs Jewish people. He went on this tour in Israel, seeing all the kibbutzes that were involved in the October 7th attack, etc. Like, how could he be anti-Semitic? You know, it's ridiculous. Now, other people have a different opinion and they'll argue that the other way. I'm not here to debate that right now. What I'm trying to say is, you would have to make the same argument and you would be hypocritical, because there are so many people who are pro-Palestine that are Jewish voices, Jewish professors, Jewish professionals, Jewish citizens of this country whose families were wiped out during the Holocaust, who are pro-Palestine and against what Israel is doing in that region in terms of policy and in terms of violence and violations of people's basic rights, etc. So this notion that if you're pro-Palestine, you're terrorist or pro-terrorist or pro... It is one of the biggest, dirtiest tactics that is being used by certain people with certain opinions on the issue. Obviously, we can kind of draw a conclusion as to who they are and what their positions are, to try to scare your average American, your average person who's less engaged on these topics, to think like, oh yeah, of course, look, I mean, they wear this, terrorists wear this on their heads, you know, the Hamas people, when they do their hostage release videos, they wear this, they must be like, 100%, solidarity with the terrorists, etc. That kind of rhetoric is so dangerous and so frustrating, because it really relies on basic cognitive biases that have been baked into the American psyche, in my opinion, from years of Hollywood movies, TV shows, and popular culture that really demonizes Middle Easterners and Arabs and trivializes and simplifies them as a caricature, rather than for being the complex, super compassionate, super loving and peace-wanting and complicated, beautiful people that they are. And it turns them into this like little trope of saying that, well, hey, because they have a headpiece that's similar to what a terrorist headpiece is in a video I've seen, they must be terrorists. They must be one and the same. That would be the equivalent of, just because Timothy McVeigh at one point wore a cowboy hat in some obscure old video or picture they find, or some school shooter, or some, Vegas shooter, or Pulse nightclub shooter. I mean, you name it, right? Any of these like mass shooting, domestic terrorism situations, because that person happened to wear a cowboy hat at some point in their life, that they are now, if you wear a cowboy hat, you're a terrorist. For my MAGA people out there, MAGA friends out there, there were famous cases when the MAGA hats, the red hats with Make America Great Again, were being worn by people young and old across the land. People were like, hey, why did this MAGA kid with a red hat walking in Washington, D.C. suddenly get attacked or harassed, or, was, yelled at for wearing a MAGA hat and treated like he doesn't have the right to wear a baseball cap, supporting a political cause that he wants to in the United States of America under the First Amendment? Like, that's insanity. Look at the radicalism of, people to even think to do that to someone because they're wearing a MAGA hat. I would say to my MAGA brothers and sisters out there in America, just like you want the protection of the law to allow you to wear a MAGA hat and feel safe walking around the streets, because it's simply a hat stating a political opinion, you would expect that people who are pro-Palestine on an issue that is very intellectual, has a lot of complex details that you need to go into to unpack and understand. I assure you, it's not as black and white as you may think. You would have to be okay with that for yourself if you're not going to be a hypocrite and have a double standard. And I challenge people to say, just like you want the right of the First Amendment to protect you wearing a MAGA hat, other people who are expressing solidarity with Palestine expect the same rights and protections under the law if we are truly going to continue in America to have a country based on the rule of law and equality and justice under the law. That's kind of the last thing I'll say around so obscuring the faces. So people are obscuring their faces by and large because of fear of retribution, either from immigration or if they're a green card holder, clearly now they could still have problems with immigration, or as U.S. citizens from being blacklisted or banned or hurt in some damaging way in terms of financially or academically or career-wise. So I just want you to think about that. Think about what other issue can you imagine where Americans show up to express their freedom of speech in a demonstration or a rally or a protest, and with their primary motivation being wanting to see the end of violence and killing and slaughter of men, women, and children, very much so women and children in the case of Gaza, but in other conflicts as well. People are coming at this from a compassionate perspective. They want to end violence and suffering. Show me another issue where the same type of activity of protest would result in someone having to fear for their livelihood, their career, being potentially harassed by the government. It's really, when you think about it, the definition of insanity in terms of the path that we've gone down and what these people are doing this for. The concern to my American brothers and sisters who are big on First Amendment, big on rule of law, would be you should be more concerned about the fact that people have to cover their faces. Why are they needing to cover their face? Versus thinking that they're covering their faces for nefarious reasons. The number of people that have done something wrong at a rally where they broke the law is so minuscule compared to the number of rallies, number of protests, number of people participating. It's hard to even, quantify. I mean, it's so minuscule. And just to be clear, I guarantee you that pretty much unanimously, 99.9% of my Palestinian American, Arab American, Muslim American brothers and sisters out there would all agree that if someone shows up to a protest and is an agitator, lights something on fire, attacks a police officer, breaks the law in a way that really crosses the line, they should be held accountable. We are in America. We are here to follow the law, but we are here to also be responsible citizens in terms of how our tax dollars are spent, and therefore the impetus for protesting and expressing our First Amendment rights so that we can draw attention to an issue that we feel like is a significant one and that our government should not be supporting or participating in any longer. Okay, so what I want to jump to next is we talked about the headgear, talked about people covering their faces. What I want to bring attention to is also we talked about the do-rag and, I'd say one more thing. So it'd be the equivalent of, for my African-American brothers and sisters, the do-rag, right? Imagine if tomorrow someone came out and said, if you wear a do-rag on your leisure time outside of work, let's say it's not proper work attire for whatever reason, you want to wear a do-rag though, when you're out playing basketball, when you're out going for a burger with your family, with your date, whatever, and it's now criminalized in America for you to wear a do-rag. What do you think the response of the American society, Black community, as well as liberal community, free speech community, all the rest would be around banning the do-rag? It would be absolutely insane. I think there would be a meltdown in this country if someone tried to propose that. And I just want to draw attention to this issue for folks. There is literally legislation that has been introduced. You can go look it up, go Google it. Legislation that has been introduced in America to actually criminalize or in some way make it a finable or a prosecutable offense for people to wear a keffiyeh, Palestinian colored keffiyeh, in public. I mean, that is absolutely the definition of insanity, if you ask me, and I hopefully most Americans. And I think people need to realize this. Like this is not just randomly being brought up as propositions for legislation. This is a concerted effort on the part of people who are directly, diametrically opposed to the Palestinian cause for self-determination, wanting to snuff out and completely extinguish any hope of symbology entering the zeitgeist of American society, of American culture and civil culture, and trying to erode it as much as possible and stamp it down in order for it to not continue to grow and for awareness to not continue to grow. There is a direct effort on people who understand how campaigns, how social movements flourish and evolve over time, where they know that this is catching on. You've got people like Macklemore and you know the lead singer to Pink Floyd and all these other people that have been associated with the Keffiyeh, the symbol. As it starts to grow and grow and grow, it will become more and more effective. And the goal is to try to stop that dead in its tracks. Imagine if someone came out and said that wearing a cowboy hat was illegal. Wearing a do-rag is illegal because, well, you know what? Do-rag is associated with gangsters and with gang culture and gang violence, and it's basically domestic terrorism. Therefore, if you wear a do-rag, you're voicing support for domestic gang terrorism. Therefore, you can't wear it anymore. It's banned, or you'll lose your job if you get caught wearing it. That is where we're heading down, folks. And I just want to make sure that people understand the context of this and how dangerous it is. So, last thing I'll say on this is next time you see one of these, please, 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 if this video has done nothing else, you should understand you do not need to be afraid of this. This is nothing more than a head garment that was once used primarily to shield people from the sun and has become, because of the colorway, much like the Jordan colorways, has become symbolic with the Palestinian cause, more so than other colorways, essentially. And so no need to be afraid, no need to be threatened or intimidated or feel threatened or intimidated. Those of my fellow Americans who live like in, you know, pockets or communities where there are large Muslim and Arab populations, people on this side of Chicago, they see people walking around with these all day, old folks, middle-aged folks, whoever. There's no threat. They go to the mall, they brush shoulders together, they have friends, colleagues, coworkers, people at work, students, whatever, that get along just fine and respect and love each other and have deep bonds and all the rest. And this does not get in the way of that. This is something that has been weaponized by people who have an agenda, that understand that Americans are susceptible to some of these things they don't necessarily fully understand or relate to, don't have the history on, and they just jump to the worst conclusion and thinking that, oh yeah, you know, it's associated with terrorism. Yeah, look, you know, Hamas wears something similar, so these people must be pro-Hamas or with Hamas. Or it is nothing more than a propaganda and a smear tactic and campaign. So what else has been conditioned to make you feel fear or distrust? This is kind of the final topic before we wrap. I think there are a slew of things that people have been conditioned to kind of fear or mistrust when it comes to, things that are going on currently around the Middle East and American Muslims, Islamophobia, the American Arab population. And another one is really, there are a lot. We'll deal with some of these other topics in different videos to be able to give them their due time and credence. But essentially, you know, the hijab, the headscarf for women, is another one that we'll do an in-depth video on. Other things would be, I would say, people who are, outwardly, now the beard has come back as something more popular among men. Like now it's almost like we're back in the 70s, like sometime in the late 2010s, teens or 2020, beards just blew up and every guy of a certain age seems like has a beard, grows out their beard. But there was a time, at least when I was growing up, where clean shaven faces were kind of more the norm. And at that time, the people who wore beards, they would call them things like beardo weirdos, or, someone's like trying to, emulate terrorism or be a terrorist or an extremist Muslim because they grew their beard. These types of things we will unpack in future videos. But these types of things are important for you to understand in terms of, just like the Keffiyeh explanation that I gave, and when you go through it in detail, you kind of click in your head and go, oh, I had no idea that this was something like, I always thought it was this scary boogeyman-y type of thing. And now I understand it's a lot less than what I thought it was because I've been misinformed. I guarantee you there are so many other issues around how people are perceived in this country Muslims, Arab Americans, etc., that will rock your world. And my goal with the podcast, with HaRLeM LiGHTs, is to bring attention to these issues more and more and try to explain them in ways that are easy to digest and easy to relate to. So please, again, once more, if you like this content or support this type of content or other content similar to this in the future on topics related to life in America for Arab Americans, for Muslim Americans, and other things. It's not all going to be just Arab American and Muslim American topics. There's tons of stuff out there that I want to get to that I think is really important in terms of building connections and bridges between different communities within the United States to make our country stronger and healthier and just a better place for people to thrive as families and individuals. Please subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast. HaRLeM LiGHTs, at HaRLeM LiGHTs is the handle on YouTube. Like us and also share us as broadly as possible on social media. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you in the future, and keep an eye out for upcoming podcast episodes. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.